The old rancher stood on his porch, staring into the howling blizzard, his weathered hands gripping the railing as if it could anchor him against the storm or the grief that tore at his heart. Amos Carver hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in months, not since the fire that stole his wife and daughter, leaving his sprawling Montana ranch as empty as his soul. The wind screamed through the pines, and he was about to turn back into the dark house when he saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow staggering through the snow. Against every instinct to shut the world out, Amos grabbed his coat and lantern, stepping into the freezing night, unaware that this moment would change his life forever. The shadow was a girl, no older than 16, crumpled in the snow just beyond his gate. Her clothes were tattered, her face bloodied, and her eyes wide with fear as Amos knelt beside her. "Easy, now," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched at his touch, but she was too weak to resist as he lifted her frail frame and carried her inside. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill of her skin, and as he cleaned the gash on her forehead, he noticed the bruises on her arms, marks of someone's cruelty. "Who did this to you?" he asked, but she only shook her head, her lips trembling. Amos didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some wounds ran deeper than words could reach. He gave her a blanket, a bowl of stew, and a cot by the fire. "One night," he said gruffly. "Storm's too bad to send you out, but tomorrow, you're on your way." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the flames, and Amos retreated to his chair, pretending not to notice how she clutched the blanket like a lifeline. He didn't want her here. The ranch was his prison, a place to endure his grief alone. Every corner held memories of his wife, Clara, laughing as she kneaded bread, or his daughter, Ellie, chasing chickens in the yard. Letting this stranger in felt like betraying them, like admitting he could still care about someone else, but as the night wore on, the girl, Lila, she finally whispered, began to talk. Hesitant at first, her voice grew stronger as she spoke of running from a foster home where fists were quicker than kindness. She'd been walking for days, hiding from the man who'd sworn to drag her back. Her story stirred something in Amos, a flicker of the protective instinct he thought had died with his family. He told himself it was nothing, that he'd send her off at dawn, but when morning came, the storm hadn't let up. The snow piled high against the door, trapping them together. Days passed, and the blizzard showed no mercy. Amos taught Lila to chop wood, more to keep her busy than anything else, but he couldn't ignore how she threw herself into the work, her small hands blistered but determined. She asked questions about the ranch, the horses, the land, and though Amos answered curtly, her curiosity chipped away at his defenses. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lila picked up Clara's old guitar, forgotten in a corner. "Can I?" she asked. Amos nodded, his throat tight. Her fingers fumbled at first, but soon a soft melody filled the room, a song of loss and hope that brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't heard music in the house since Clara died. The more time they spent together, the more Amos saw Ellie and Lila, not in her face, but in her stubborn spirit, her quiet strength. It terrified him. Caring meant risking pain, and he'd vowed never to feel that again. Yet Lila's presence was like sunlight breaking through a long winter. She fixed a broken fence without being asked, laughed at his grumpy complaints about the cold, and left wildflowers on the kitchen table, a small gesture that made the house feel alive. But Amos knew she couldn't stay. The storm would end, and so would this fragile peace. Worse, he feared whoever was hunting her would find her here. One night, Lila's nightmares woke them both. She thrashed on the cot, crying out for someone named Tommy. Amos shook her awake, and in her panic, she clung to him, sobbing. "He's coming for me," she gasped. "My foster dad. He won't stop." Amos's jaw tightened. He knew men like that, men who fed on fear. "He won't touch you here," he promised, surprised by the steel in his voice. For the first time in months, he felt like more than a ghost haunting his own life. He was a protector again, even if only for a moment. The storm finally broke on the 10th day, leaving the world glittering under a clear sky. Amos stared at the open road, knowing he should send Lila away, but the thought twisted his gut. She stood beside him, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes searching his. "I don't want to go," she admitted. "But I can't stay if he finds me." Amos made a decision then, one that scared him more than any storm. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Not until we figure this out." He drove her to town, to the sheriff's office, where Lila told her story. The sheriff, an old friend of Amos's, promised to track down her foster father, a man with a record long enough to ensure he'd never hurt her again. But the process wasn't quick, and Lila stayed at the ranch while the law worked. Amos didn't mind. He taught her to ride his gentlest mare, and she helped him mend the barn, their days filled with small, healing moments. One afternoon, she found an old photo of Ellie and Clara in the attic. Instead of hiding it, Amos told her about them, his voice breaking but steady. Lila listened, then hugged him, a simple act that felt like a lifeline. Weeks turned to months, and the sheriff's investigation bore fruit. Lila's foster father was arrested, and with Amos's help, she was granted permission to stay on the ranch as his ward. The legalities were daunting, but Amos faced them with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. Lila wasn't a replacement for Ellie, she was her own person, fierce and kind, and she'd given him something he thought was lost, a reason to live. The ranch came alive again, with Lila's laughter echoing in the yard and Amos's gruff voice calling her to supper. One spring evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lila turned to him. "You saved me, you know," she said. Amos shook his head. "No, girl. You saved me." He looked out at the land, the mountains standing tall against the sky, and felt Clara and Ellie's presence, not as a weight, but as a warmth. Grief hadn't vanished, but it had made room for hope, for family, for life. The story ends where it began, on that porch, but now the rancher isn't alone. The camera pans out, showing Amos and Lila side by side, the ranch glowing under the golden light. A voiceover delivers the final words, "Sometimes, the ones we save are the ones who save us." The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with a message of resilience and redemption, that even in the darkest storms, love can find a way to heal.